It's great to be back in Tampa, actually in person. I did a service, I think, 2 years ago during the chaos of COVID in the kind of small containment of my study in Belfast. But it's good to have my feet on the ground here in Tampa. And to my good friend McGray, my deepest thanks for allowing me to share with your faith family here in Hyde Park, United Methodist Church. I know you've been moving through this series on the meaning of Methodism, and the title that I've been given is how does Methodism, or how do we as individuals, how do we as churches connect with an increasingly difficult, uncertain world? So I want to quote an Anglican to begin with who suggests John Stott, who died at the age of 92. And John Stott describes Methodist theology, that we sort of talk about personal holiness and social holiness, or proclamation and presence is another way of describing that. He actually describes it like a bird with two wings. So we have personal holiness here, we have social holiness here. And as all of us know who are listening in today, if you kind of slice off one of the wings of that bird, the bird collapses. And so I just want to suggest, as we wrestle with this topic together, that maybe one of the reasons Methodism may seem a little bit lopsided in the 21st century is we've actually forgotten our roots, namely social holiness, or another way I often describe it is, how do we do faith or do church in the public square? The passage that we're moving through today is 2 Corinthians 11 to 21. And this passage, interestingly, has been described by some serious theological thinkers as actually one of the most theologically charged passages of any of Paul's letters, particularly in terms of salvation and Christ's role in that act of salvation. It's interesting as we kind of flip through those sacred texts and what we describe as the New Testament. Sharing your faith in the outside space never seemed to be an issue. I mean, not once can you point to me and say, Gary, there is a passage where an apostle is urging or exhorting or scolding, planning, organizing evangelistic programs. Relational evangelism just seemed to happen, almost in a kind of seamless, effortless manner from a community of people of faith. It was automatic, it was spontaneous, it was continuous, and it was contagious. Going back to Wesley's very famous dictum where he says, "The world is my parish." So I just want to highlight three simple things that I see spilling out of this passage, which I hope are helpful. Here's a question. I mean, why is the Apostle Paul so motivational or passionate in these first few verses? He highlights there ever so clearly in verse 14. He says, the reason why I am doing this is because Jesus' love actually compels us. He says, because of this supreme example of Christ dying for all people, we're living to please God by serving God. And then he isolates, interestingly, what I describe as the motivational characteristics for Christian service. In verse 11 there, he talks about knowledge of accountability to Christ. And then in verse 14, he highlights awareness of Christ's example of self-sacrificing devotion. Interestingly, the word there in the original language of the Greek language means that in verse 14, I don't have any other option but to be motivational. I need to have a purpose in life. I must confess, one of my favorite American actors, and this dates me slightly, as it may some of you, is Jack Nicholson. I've seen many of his movies, but he's in a movie called About Smith that some of you may or may not have seen, and he stars as this character called Warren Smith. And you could only describe him as a person, a man, leading a life of simply quiet desperation. He retires from a very senior position, a vice president of an insurance company. And then he begins what many people do when they do retire. He begins to look back. And in reality, he's looking back on simply what is a meaningless life that is moving towards a meaningless retirement. And one day, as he's sitting reflecting on this meaningless retirement, he sees an opportunity to give money, write letters to this little underprivileged kid in Tanzania. And Warren responds to the appeal, and throughout the movie, he faithfully sends $22 a month, and he writes very poignant, deep-meaning letters to this young kid called Nduga. And on one occasion, after a pretty long road trip, Warren comes back to an empty house. Really, in many ways, it describes it almost as a kind of metaphor for an empty life. He reluctantly walks in with a kind of armload of typical impersonal junk mail that we all suffer in the 21st century. He wanders up the stairs. He looks kind of pretty disappointedly at the mess of his bedroom. But interestingly, throughout the scene, the audience hears Warren's voice over narration of a letter that he's recently composed to Nduga. And he pours out to this little boy really immense, intense feelings of emptiness. He says this: I know we're all pretty small in the scheme of things, and I guess the best we can hope for is to make a difference of some kind. And then he does this kind of personal self-introspection or reflection, like, what difference have I made? What in the world is better because of me as a human being? I'm weak. I'm a failure. And let's be honest, let's just get around to it. Real soon, I'm going to, die. Maybe 20 years, maybe even tomorrow. It doesn't matter. And once I am dead and everyone who knows me has died, it's as though I never existed. What difference has my life made to any person on this planet? Absolutely none that I can think of. Yours truly, Warren Smith. But at the end of the narration in the movie, Warren's face slowly, surprisingly actually, gives way to wonder as he stares down at this little letter from Tanzania. And it's a letter from a nun, a religious nun who works in the orphanage, where this little 6-year-old Nduga lives. She tells Warren that Nduga thinks of him every day, and hopes that he is happy. And enclosed within the letter is a picture drawn by Nduga for Warren. 2 stick people holding hands. And in the movie, as you know if you've seen it, Warren is absolutely overcome by the realization that finally, I've made a difference. And he lifts up his hands to his tired face, and he begins to cry. And I suppose in reality, Warren sees he's making a difference, or in the words of our sermon title today, Warren has finally connected with the world and has become relational and realizes that the totality of life is not being vice president of an insurance company. It's interesting, the scholar and ethicist Daniel Harawas, who spent a number of years at Duke University, has suggested almost cheekily and impishly, which he can do exceptionally well, that God may well be at work in the decline of the mainline church. And he suggests, perhaps prophetically, you make your mind up, that the inward turned focus of so many churches has made them simply irrelevant. That the church isn't meant to function as some country club for Christians. The church's primary mission, as the sermon title says, is connection with outside spaces. The message of the gospel, the good news to those who are outside the church. Let me quote another colleague from Duke, Will Willimon, who's still a good friend after all these years. My wife Joyce and I were in Duke in March, I think, 2019, before the chaos of COVID. We spent 3 or 4 days there, lecturing in classes, speaking at the chapel, and naturally I reconnected with Will Willimon, who'd been with me several times in Belfast when I was pastoring churches a number of years ago. And as we all know, Will Willimore, not dissimilar to Stanley, has this kind of prophetic, caustic, cheeky, probing sense of humor. And I remember him saying to my congregation, I need to let you know that Gary is not here to meet your needs. In exactly the same way that no pastor in Hyde Park United Methodist is here to meet your needs. The role of the pastor is to make you holy, to make you connect with the outside world. And I sometimes cheekily say myself, I think too many of our churches don't want a Gary Mason or a McGray as their pastor. They'd be better maybe with Jerry Springer or Oprah Winfrey. We want some sort of kind of pop psychology to meet our needs on a Sunday morning. But yet Paul in his text very clearly and very concisely is saying, I'm driving you out of your musty, fusty, dusty, rarefied church buildings to connect with the outside world. There was a family that really wasn't in the practice of going to church, and they attended the large, pretty formal wedding of a friend. And the family's youngest child, just 3 years of age, kind of sat perched on his dad's knee, watching all those bizarre comings and goings that only those of us who go to church know and know only too well. And then there came a time within the service when a hymn had to be sung, and the organist crashed very confidently or confidently into the opening chords of the song. As we sometimes say, kind of putting the pedal to the metal in order to make a really good impression for this kind of society wedding. And immediately the kind of 3-year-old little boy cringed in terror, threw his arms around his dad's neck and say, Daddy, make them stop that spooky music. Now let's be honest. How many of us have ever felt spooked in church? Because for those outside who are not familiar with some of those kind of weird and wonderful ways of the church, traditions can seem odd or perhaps maybe downright threatening. We forget that our language, our churchy language, is alien to so many people. The French philosopher and skeptic Voltaire once said, if you would speak with me, you first must learn my language. And the irony is for all of us, if we're honest, who have grown up in this institutional space for decades, we can sound arrogant, judgmental in our insistence upon learning ecclesiastical language and customs before speaking with God. And so I want to suggest, because of that, the second thing I want to highlight is that we need to be non-judgmental. Look at the phrase there in verse 16 in the passage, where Paul highlights, don't regard any person from a worldly point of view. What was Paul saying? Paul was simply saying this: I'm not making superficial, personal judgments based on external appearances. I'm not going to judge a person in terms of their nationality, their identity, or dare I say it, in your contested space of the United States at the moment, by their politics, by their skin color. But Paul was going to do his judging in terms of spiritual status. So in sharing faith, none of us listening into this space today should be making what I call superficial judgments. And I've often watched people attempting to connect with the world, moving into those spaces, wanting to kind of take charge of the conversation and keeping it on track. For many people, it looks more like salespersonship than actual friendship. And so if you're connecting with the world, it is a dialogue, it is not a monologue. I don't know why you've seen the movie The Good Girl. I will quote now, to be fair to my marriage, one of my wife's favourite actresses, having quoted mine, Jack Nicholson, so I need to keep that balance in my relationship, having said that to you. So Jennifer Aniston. And she stars as Justice Lass, a 30-year-old, I suppose, in American terms, small town girl, who's absolutely fed up with his boring job at retail rodeo. I mean, even the name sounds pretty boring, if we're going to be honest, but this 30-year-old young woman is totally fed up with that space. And in one scene very early in the movie, Justin is approached by a person, sorry about this name, called Corny, a security guard at retail rodeo, who demonstrates perhaps the best way not to evangelize. Let me give you an insight into this dialogue. So Corny begins the encounter by, "Hey, Justin, can I talk with you for just a second?" She pleasantly says, "Yes, of course." And then he responds, "I was just a little bit curious. Have you ever been to a Bible study?" Justin goes, "Yeah." Corny says, "Yeah, well, we do a really good study every Wednesday night down at the First Church of the Nazarene. Rodney comes, Benita comes. Have you got any interest in reading the Bible?" Justin hesitantly stammers out, I have my own, beliefs." Corny says, "Well, we don't preach fire and brimstone. 10 commandments. Yeah, you got to live by those. Those kind of usual ways, we're not interested in scaring people. We're just about loving Jesus." Justin stumbles a little bit more. "Okay, yeah. I kind of like my nice to myself." And Corny finally responds with a wonderful, engaging, spiritual line. "Well, maybe you'll have a night of eternal hell all to yourself. Just kidding you. Drive safely." And Justin just goes, "Bye-bye." And for many people outside our space, that's what church actually looks like. And I think one writer hits the nail on the head when he emphasizes the difference between, coming here or go to hell ministries. We need a go and tell ministry. People often say, "Come and hear the gospel in our church, preached by an outstanding evangelist." I know we need our church institutions, but I would challenge you once to find a passage in Scripture where Jesus said to anyone, "Come and hear me preach in the synagogue." There's none. Literally none. And I know we need our institutions, even though I struggle with them at times. Even as someone who's been part of the world of Methodist institutional religion for over 3 decades. The people in need to hear that the gospel is life-changing and engaging primarily are not inside this rarefied atmosphere of church. Most of them are out in the public square, or out in the public space. And I think what sets that vision or underlines that is that parable in relation to the lost sheep. And I've heard so many interpretations of the 99. I mean, kind of concerned interpreters have said, well, probably the shepherd must have somehow secured care and safety for those 99 while he went out searching. The parable doesn't say anything of the sort. I think what drives Jesus, or what drives the shepherd, is a determination, maybe bordering almost on an obsession, to find and reclaim the lost sheep. And remember the audience Jesus was speaking to. It was the theological elite, the experts, or so-called experts of the day. The scribes, the Pharisees. And Jesus implicitly asks them to validate the shepherd's astonishing determination. So instead of judging the shepherd for foolishly leaving the 99, Jesus brings his listeners, as he can do so amazingly, into this story. And when the shepherd ultimately returns triumphantly with the animal, the scribes and the Pharisees are now to listen as they would as if they were their own shepherds, friends, and neighbors. And how many of those parables do we see? The lost coin, the lost sheep. Why do we hear them? The repetition is intentional. It actually, I think, heightens the listener's recognition of determined searching, finding, ecstatic rejoicing as God's unexpected response to lostness. Sweeping a room, going out into a storm to find lostness. The final thing I want to highlight is this whole concept of be reconciling. Look at verse 20 and 21. The phrase in verse 20 where it says, we are ambassadors of Christ. We're representing Christ. God is making his appeal through us. And again, to go back to another philosopher of another generation, Frederick Nietzsche, who, as all of us know from history, had an incredible influence on Adolf Hitler. Nietzsche once commented, these Christians will need to look a lot more redeemed before I can believe in it. These Christians will need to look a lot more redeemed before I can believe in it. And it reminds me of a story of two ministerial students from a university in Birmingham, Alabama, doing kind of summer evangelistic, sharing faith work in a very rural area near Montgomery in Alabama. And you know what those summers are like? As an Irishman being here in Florida, they are tough in the south, to put it mildly, especially for my poor Irish white skin. So one day they stop their car in front of a farmhouse. They proceed up a path through this almost gauntlet of kind of screaming children, barking dogs. They eventually come and knock loudly on the screen door. And the woman of the house stops, looks up, scrubbing over a tub and a washboard, brushes back her hair, wipes away her perspiration from her brow, and says, what do you want? And they say, ma'am, we would like to tell you how to obtain eternal life. And the tired homemaker, mommy, hesitates for a moment and then replies, thank you, but I don't believe I could stand it. Now, if I was writing that scene or doing that evangelism, I think a better one-liner may have been, well, ma'am, we were just passing by and we saw your kids playing on this hot summer's afternoon. The dogs are barking crazily. Can we play soccer with your kids? Maybe get some water for your dogs. Perhaps you need your dogs walked. That is a ministry of reconciliation. That is engaging. That is showing a religion that functions, a religion that actually works. And I suppose I ask the question, unashamedly yet categorically, how do we allow theology to spill into the public square? And so I want to finish with a poem that I've read so many times, I could probably close my eyes and say it. But it talks about a symbol that has changed all our lives, namely the cross of Christ. And the theologian George MacLeod says this, I simply argue that the cross be raised again at the center of the marketplace, as well as on the steeple of the church. I am recovering the claim that Jesus was not crucified in a cathedral between two candles, but on a cross between two thieves. And in a town garbage heap at a crossroad of politics, so cosmopolitan, that they had to write his title in Hebrew, Latin, and in Greek. And at the kind of place where cynics talked smut, where thieves cursed and soldiers gambled, because that is where he died. And that is what he died about. And that is where Christ's own ought to be. And that is where church people ought to be. So let me just suggest we're asking this whole concept about connecting with the world. The title is not connecting with the church, important as that may be. But ask yourself the question as a person, are you a person who is reconciling to others? Is that part of who you are? Is that part of what you do? Have you got an engagement that brings about a reconciling mechanism? Are you a non-judgmental person? Because this text is highlighting, not from me, a mere Methodist minister, but from a person who wrote over half of the New Testament. I am encouraging you to not judge any person by appearance, etc., etc., etc. So are you reconciling? Are you a non-judgmental person? And Paul also highlights, as we pull this together, that one final quality: be motivational. The church is not a 60 minutes worship experience on a Sunday where you give me or McGray or the choir or the organist or the worship band points out of 10. I often describe church as a kind of spiritual jab or shot into your arm, and we know about those after COVID. But that's what church should be on a regular basis, giving you a spiritual shot to drive you out into the public space to make a difference. And as we all know, those early Methodist preachers were not welcome in some of those Anglican, stuffy churches of another generation. So they went out into all those spaces where they engaged with humanity. And remember this, that Methodism and those early revivalists, they were the people, many of them wrestling with things like the curse of slavery, child labor, etc., etc., making a difference in the public square. And so I simply want to say to colleagues and friends at Hyde Park, as you look at this massive city of Tampa, where do you spend your time? Mostly within this rarefied atmosphere of church, or out in the public square, in the public space? Because I do know this: that is where Jesus spent the vast, vast bulk of his ministry as he walked planet Earth. Amen.